Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started with a wonderful webinar, Classroom Strategies Part 1, Transitions, presented by Merceydes Morassi, LMHC and BCBA, KUMDC Behavior Analyst.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, this initially was a two-part presentation, but we combined it today. So we're going to do part one, part two, all the transitions today. Okay, so what are transitions? Transitions are when we are moving our attention or our physical bodies from one location or one activity to another. And transitions are often associated with problem behavior, but why, right? That's kind of what we wanted to talk about today. Why are they associated with problem behavior? And better yet, what can we do about it? But before we get into that, let's talk about some transitions that affect all of us. So, like, for example, transitions in adult life. Every Monday, we transition back into our work, leaving behind the weekend, and we've got all sorts of catchphrases for this process. Oops, I hit a button. Sorry. Let me fix this. There we go. Okay. We've got all sorts of catchphrases for this process. For example, we say like the Sunday scaries. Well, Sundays are not inherently scary. We know that, but we call it this for a reason. It's that period of time before we transition into the Monday, and that makes us feel uneasy or scared or whatever. Or maybe you've heard someone ask if they have a case of the Mondays. What do you have, a case of the Mondays? Are Mondays inherently hard? No. So, yes, the obvious answer to both of those questions is no, but they do a good job in highlighting the aversiveness of transitions, even highly predictable transitions. For example, maybe you've been in the same job for 10 years and you still get the Sunday scaries. It's a highly predictable thing. You know you're going to work on Monday, but Sunday night you still feel that way. So, even highly predictable and routine transitions can be associated with negative feelings. And this happens for all sorts of people, even people without developmental or psychological issues. So we have to then also wonder, how does that feel for a kid who does maybe have a developmental disability? Okay, transitions in adult life. So Sundays are scary, okay, because we are aware that the reinforcement is ending and that something is aversive or something aversive is about to begin. So we're leaving behind the relaxation and the fun that we have on the weekend, aka the reinforcement, and we're going to have to begin either tedious or difficult, time-consuming work. The thoughts about the transition can be aversive in themselves. Just thinking about, Monday, even though it's not Monday yet, just thinking about it can feel aversive. And then I have an example here. Have you ever seen a kid start crying before the end of recess bell even rings? Like the bell hasn't rang yet, but maybe they pick up some other cues knowing that recess is about to be over and they're already crying. And it's like, why would they be crying? Because they're anticipating. They know that the end is near. Mondays are hard because we are transitioning from weekends, which include rest and fun, things that are reinforcing. I kind of already said this. We're going into something that is less reinforcing. The thing is no one looks forward to doing something or going somewhere they don't want to be. That's just a simple fact of the matter. We have to keep that in mind. So, point blank, transitions can be hard for anyone. Why do tantrums and other problem behavior occur during transitions? Well, we already know it's a difficult time, but there's a lot of studies that have looked at this, that have looked at specific problem behaviors associated with transitioning and why those problem behaviors are most likely to occur. So, several studies indicate specific reasons for problem behaviors like tantrums or SIB, which stands for self-injurious behavior. Could be head banging, could be skin picking, biting themselves. It could be a number of things. And these occurrences during transitions. The first reason would be that the kid wants to continue engaging in the pre-transition activity. So if this is maybe there's some sort of free time and then we're going to transition into a structured activity like math, right? So the problem behavior kicks off because they don't want to transition to math. They want to stay in this free time or the pre-transition activity. So basically, they don't want to stop what they're doing. And this would be one of the main reasons we see for problem behavior. Another reason, they want to avoid or delay the activity they're transitioning to or the actual location of the activity. It might not be the activity itself, it might be the location. For example, sometimes in schools, they have to move to a different classroom, whether they're going to be pulled out for OT or whether they're going to maybe go into a PE classroom or an art class or something like that. It might be the location or it might be the activity itself. And so the problem behavior is an attempt to avoid going there or to delay going there. So, like if I throw enough of a tantrum, I can delay there and I can, maybe I can shave off a few minutes of time that would otherwise be spent in this activity I don't want to be doing. Another reason could be that this new activity, what they're transitioning to, has less reinforcement available, making it less preferred. So, an example of this, the example I gave of like transitioning to a different classroom, maybe the teacher in that class is not as friendly, doesn't give as much feedback, isn't as positive or as motivating. And so it's not the activity, it's not the location, it's the fact that going into this classroom is going to be less reinforcing than the one I was already in. Therefore, I don't want to go. And this is where we see, maybe a tantrum or some other type of behavior. So, how can we prepare for transitions and why is it important? Well, transitions are much easier when a child can anticipate when, where, and why the transition is happening. So, visual schedules and verbal reminders are huge here. Let me see, I think I just heard a chat. No, okay, there we go. So visual schedules and verbal reminders are huge. So one thing we should do is we should try to review the schedule daily. A daily schedule is very important, but if we review it every morning, kind of let the children know, okay, this is what is expected. This is what the day is going to look like, but then also provide various reminders throughout the day. For example, a 30-minute reminder and then a 5-minute reminder. So, like, okay, guys, just remember 30 more minutes and then we're going to transition into math, or 5 more minutes and we have to put away all of our arts and crafts. Um, Stuff like that can be very helpful. Although, interestingly enough, research says that preparation alone is not usually enough to stop the problem behavior. The preparation, the warnings, the visual cues, that is very helpful, but we need to do that in and of itself doesn't usually get rid of the problem. So what else would we do, right? That's probably the more important question. Um, well, before we get there, let me talk about how to schedule smart and how to schedule for success because there are good schedules and there are not so good schedules. And you want to try to create a schedule for your day that makes it more likely for these transitions to go well or to go smoothly. So, how do we set up a successful schedule? The first thing we should do is we should take notes on which activities the kids seem to like most and which they like least, and essentially rank them. So, you have this kind of like hierarchy of preference. Okay, this is the most preferred, this is the least preferred. This is really important information to have once you start creating the schedule and figuring out which activities essentially come first and which follow the others. We want to create behavioral momentum. So, in order to do this, we have to identify tasks that have a high success rate. What are the tasks that these kids are most likely to complete? That they're, that are, I guess you could say easy, that are generally able to be completed without an issue. So, we want to think about those tasks and we want to set up a couple of those before we move into something difficult. Why is that? It's because we don't want a cold start. If there is an activity that is going to be difficult to transition into, we set up these high probability tasks before, so we essentially create some momentum, right? The ball gets rolling, and then we can essentially take that momentum and roll it into this more difficult task or the task that they typically avoid transitioning to. Okay, what else? This is really important with the schedule. And I'm thinking of like a visual schedule right now because visual schedules tend to be really helpful for younger kids or kids who maybe have some problem, verbalizing. Visual schedule is great. So you have this, say you have this visual schedule. What you want to do is you want to stagger the non-preferred and the preferred tasks. So like preferred, non-preferred, preferred, non-preferred. So that there's not, you don't want, basically what you don't want is a bunch of non-preferred tasks in a row or all of the highly preferred tasks at once. And then we have to transition into a bunch of things they don't like. We want to do one and then the other. This is really helpful in order to contrive motivation, in order to reinforce their participation in a not so preferred task. So we want to try to put fun and reinforcing activities immediately after hard activities. And when we do this, we also need to make everything in the schedule contingent upon completion of the item in front of it. So, like for example, what's coming to mind is like a few years ago there was a really popular like kids song, The Floor is Lava. I think some kids still listen to it, but it kind of was associated with a game where they would play this song and then all the kids would, there was a certain part of the song where they'd say the floor is lava and all the kids would jump on the furniture as if the floor was lava, right? That's really fun. Most of the kids loved that activity. So if I was structuring a schedule, I would think since most of the kids loved that activity, that would be really high up on the preference list. And I would try to take that activity and put it after one of the more difficult activities of the day. For example, maybe that would be like writing. Maybe most of the kids have trouble with writing, or there's a select few that have trouble with writing. They don't want to do it. They resist doing it. Transitions into that activity are difficult. But if I take that activity and right after it, I put the floor is lava, and the kids know we cannot move on to playing the floor is lava until we've completed this writing activity, then I'm going to see less issues transitioning into that activity because they know what comes after. Okay, I can just get this done and then I can go and play the floor is lava. So everything in the schedule needs to be contingent upon the completion of the item in front of it. That way it essentially becomes a rule. I have to do this somewhat aversive or neutral or whatever. I have to do this thing that I don't really want to do in order to gain access to this thing I really do want to do. And this will motivate. This can motivate them to get through the thing that is somewhat more aversive. All right, so big picture. Ideally, you want to start the day with something engaging, fun, and relatively easy. So I've seen like in maybe kindergarten classes, they might start with like circle time where they're kind of like singing songs and they're talking about what day is it. It's kind of an easier task. Then we would move into something that requires some effort, but still has a high probability of being completed. We might from there do something that is a little bit reinforcing. You on that reinforcer hierarchy, you wouldn't want to give them the top of the top, right? You'd want something that's mildly reinforcing, but not super reinforcing. So, for example, no floor is lava. We would do that mildly reinforcing task, then move into something slightly more difficult. And essentially that's where the staggering starts. Slightly more difficult, little bit of reinforcement. And then as we get the more difficult tasks, we're starting to follow them with the very reinforcing activities afterwards. We make sure that the most difficult task is followed by something incredibly reinforcing that absolutely cannot be accessed without the completion of this difficult task. So this is where it is sometimes a little bit tricky, right? Because let's say you're going to use food and that's probably not the case for many people, but look, it makes an easy example. If I was going to say, okay, the most difficult task for most of my students is math, and right after math, I'm going to make sure everybody gets a cookie. Well, I have to make sure that they A, haven't had cookies earlier in the day, and B, they're not going to get those cookies at any other time. And I can't ensure that because they can go home and have the same cookies. And so, therefore, me saying, do the math and you get the cookie, it's not that reinforcing. So, you want to find an activity or an item or something that is reinforcing, but that they can't get at any other time. That can be a little bit tricky. This is why like kind of like the floor is lava activity is a good one because yes, they could listen to that song at home, but it's probably not as reinforcing as when we listen to it in a classroom and the teacher can play with the lights and we have the music loud and all the other kids are yelling and screaming and it kind of creates this ambiance, right? So we want to pick the most reinforcing activity and we want to try to pick one that they can't get anywhere else. So to do this, we have to consider what is always accessible to them, not just in school, but at home. You might not know, but you want to try to think about that when you're staggering and creating a schedule. And if it is something they can access all the time or as soon as they get home, it won't motivate them to complete the aversive. Again, if I can have cookies any time of day, that's not going to motivate me to get through this math task. All right, so how can we make these transitions easier? Transitions can be made easier if there's something reinforcing that immediately follows the non-preferred task and is only available after the task has been completed, which is kind of what I was talking about when we're staggering the schedule. We set it up so that it looks like that. So again, an example, once all the kids finish math, we can put on a dancing song or a cartoon, but this song and cartoon is only available after the math task. So there is no negotiation at that point. Well, maybe we won't do math. We'll do this instead and then we'll get the cartoon. No. Once you create a contingency and you say we have to do the math and then we get this, it is very important that we uphold that contingency so that, we're essentially we look like we're keeping our word. They can learn the kids start to recognize, okay, when they say this or when they kind of put out this rule, essentially the rule cannot be broken. We could do a warm-up task to create momentum or to contrive interest. So I like some of these. I think some of these are cute ideas. For example, if you're going to start doing math problems like multiplication or addition, whatever, maybe out loud, we might have them say answer to easy problems like what is 1 plus 1? So if I'm going to have them start working on multiplication, what is 2 times 2? What is 2 times 4? Before I start that, I might go, okay, everybody, what's 1 plus 1? And they go, 2. They know it's easy. It's going to be easy for them to say that. So that might warm them up kind of in the math arena. If they're going to read a book, maybe we show them the cover of the book and we say, okay, this is a book called, I don't know, Good Night Moon. What do we think it's about, you guys? Look at the cover. What do we think it's about? And then they start talking and they get maybe a little bit excited or a little bit interested in the book. Okay, what is this book going to be about? How else can we continue to make these transitions easier? The non-preferred task is made to be more appetitive, meaning whatever it is that they don't want to do, we find a way to make that activity more enjoyable, more exciting, or to create some sort of motivation to engage with it. So the example that I give here for us adults, right, on our Sunday scaries and the resistance to transitioning back to work on Monday. If every Monday when we went into the office, there was donuts and fancy coffee, Mondays wouldn't be so scary anymore. We'd be like, "Ooh, it's a Monday." Maybe we'd learn to dread a Tuesday instead of a Monday because Mondays would be associated with donuts and coffee. So for the classroom, what we could think about is like maybe when they're transitioning from something like, say, recess, and that's might be a big problem area because they're running and playing and having fun, and then we're like, okay, everybody come back inside. When they come back inside, what if we gave them a very fun activity to do, or we give a piece of candy or a sticker, something about the transition itself of coming back inside becomes more exciting or more enjoyable because we've added something to it. We can make the transition process itself fun. This is also, I think, really important. For example, the cleanup song. Whoever created that song was a genius. Okay, because that's essentially what it's doing. It's taking something that all kids have resisted at some point. Okay, it's time to clean up your toys. No, and we turn it into a game. Clean up, everybody, everywhere. Now all of a sudden, the kids want to clean up, or even if they don't want to clean up, it's less aversive because there's some element of it that is somewhat fun. They're singing a song, maybe we're playing as we're cleaning up. So we could do this when we're transitioning in from one activity to another in the classroom or from classroom to classroom or location to location. We could find a song that we could sing. We could find some sort of game to play. So some examples that I kind of just thought of, for example, maybe you're trying to get the kids to go from circle time back to the table or back to their desks so we can engage in a structured activity. And maybe you make some sort of game, right? You're like, okay, I want everybody to tiptoe as quietly and slowly as possible back to their desks. I want you to do it like you were a monster hiding in the closet. You don't want anyone to find you. Why am I doing that? Because it's interesting, because it's fun. Ooh, they get to pretend like they're monsters. But what is my point? My point is I'm getting them back to their desks, and I found a way to do it that makes them somewhat interested and more compliant because it's not just go back to your desks, we're going to do worksheets, right? It's we're going to be tiptoeing monsters that get back to our desks. Or maybe, for example, when you need them to put away their backpacks. Okay, everyone go put away your backpacks and then hop on one foot back to your desk. And then when you get to your desk, sit down and shout out your favorite food. Again, it's a game. I'm making a game of this transitional process. We could also have them sing songs, or we could do I spy, I spy something red. Okay, everybody, as we're walking back to the desks, try to figure out what it is that I spy that is red. So there's a number of ways that we could try to make the transition process itself more fun. All right. If we think that problem behavior is going to occur, there are some things we could try to do to avoid that problem behavior or potentially make it less problematic. One thing that we can do is allow a transitional object to come to the non-preferred tasks. And then research says that if we do this plus issue a warning, this can be really effective in mitigating a problem behavior. What is a transitional object? Well, it can be numerous things, but for example, let's say the kids are all doing some sort of free time activity. Like I'm thinking of like preschools where they have like little stations, they have Lego stations, and I don't know, they have uh dolls or something over here. And it's like, okay, we're done with the free time activity, everybody. We're going to clean up and we're going to come back to our desks. Well, if they don't want to, maybe because they want to continue playing Legos or they want to continue playing dolls, maybe I can allow them to take something small that's not going to be super intrusive or distracting to the other kids. I can let them take it back with them. Like Legos, for example, the little Lego guys. Maybe I have them clean up all the Legos, but I say, okay, you can take the little Lego guy with you back to your desk and put it on your desk while we do this next activity. We can also try to engage the child in something similar or see if we can get them to gravitate towards the location of the new activity for some other reason. This is where we're being a little bit tricky. So, kind of like I was saying, I spy. Instead of saying we're going to play I Spy while we walk back to the desks, I leave out the last part. All right, come on, everybody. We're going to do an I Spy walk. Let's walk around the classroom, or maybe I'm walking around the school. In reality, I might be walking them to a PE class or an art class or something that maybe creates transitional problems, right? Problem behavior pops up. But instead of saying that's where we're going, I'm going to say we're going to walk around the school and we're going to try to look for things that are the color yellow. How many yellow colored things can we find along the way? That at least is getting them in the direction of where we're trying to go, um, without potentially while avoiding the problem behavior. Okay. And now then we have this part. This part is really important because how we deal with the problem behavior once it occurs, um, will determine a lot of things. For example, if the problem behavior is going to continue, if it's going to get worse, et cetera. So how we deal with it is very important. One thing we have to keep in mind is we cannot allow problem behavior to delay or avoid the transition to the next activity. If a tantrum is starting because they don't want to go back to their desk to do math, we cannot allow that to persist because essentially, if they are able to get out of doing math by engaging in this tantrum, they learn that that's an effective way to get out of doing math. So we do not want to allow any problem behavior to delay or avoid the transition. We need to keep it moving. If we do, again, it almost ensures that the problems will continue. If a child is resisting transitioning to a math assignment, we could remind them what comes after the math assignment. This is where we have that visual schedule. We could even point to it and be like, remember, we can't do the floor is lava until we get through this math assignment. That can be motivating in itself. It can kind of help move the child forward. Okay, let's get on to the next task. We do not want to let them continue working on something else or to stall. You also don't want to allow them, for example, what I've seen in the past is sometimes if you have a kid who's having trouble transitioning, maybe they're having trouble transitioning. We'll just continue using math as an example. And then they kick off into this tantrum, and then, someone comes and removes them from the classroom and takes them to another classroom where they're able to de-stress or play with Play-Doh or do something calming. No, you just taught them that their tantrum gets them out of math. And so even if you are going to remove them from that area, the math has to follow because it's very important that we're saying, look, even if you have this problem behavior, the tantrum, the SIB, whatever, we're still going to make it a requirement that you complete this task. And okay, so we can't allow them to work on anything else. We can't allow them to stall. We have to keep moving it forward towards this task. We can remove anything that is reinforcing in their area. So if they're trying to continue playing with Legos or if they're trying to do something else, we need to remove those things and redirect back to the task. Nope, sorry, it's math time. We also want to make sure not to provide too much attention while we're doing this process. We do not need to over explain. We have a visual schedule. We've already said what we're transitioning to. We've already said what follows the transition. There doesn't need to be a lot more words than that. If there are too many words, sometimes we run the risk of kind of reinforcing the behavior by giving it too much attention. And so now maybe the tantrum started because they didn't want to complete a math assignment. But now they're finding that whenever they tantrum, people are talking to them and trying to reason with them and trying to bribe them. And they're like, oh, this is kind of fun. We don't want that. So these are kind of important tips to follow with any problem behavior that occurs during a transition. Um, some other potential suggestions, like things you can try. And obviously, this depends on the scenario, on the students involved, whatever. Let's say you have two kids that you typically keep separated from each other, maybe because they goof off too much, they have too much fun. Maybe you let them sit together only during, I have an AN activity. That would be aversive or neutral. So it's not a preferred activity. It's either a neutral activity or an aversive activity. Maybe we let them sit together only during those activities, and then they will transition to that task or activity with ease because they're actually looking forward to sitting next to the friend. And so what we've done is we've created a reason or a motivation for transitioning to this new activity. So we'll use math again, right? They don't want to do math. Maybe it's Joey and Johnny, and we always keep them separated because they goof off too much. But guess what? Hey, Joey and Johnny, whenever we do math, you guys get to sit by each other and work together. Now they're going to be highly motivated to get to the math activities. It's not really the math activity that they want, it's the ability to sit by each other. So you might say, well, but they're going to be distracted. Yes, but now we've at least created an opportunity for math to not be aversive, and we can figure out how to motivate them and keep them on task in this math activity. And I think that might be an easier fix than having to deal with tantrums that happen before the math activity is even started. So one thing I said in here, like they'll transition easier. You could also then put them both directly in front of you so that you can give them support and guidance. But it would be important to allow for some socialization and goofing off too. That is their way of making this activity more reinforcing. Not too much goofing off, but maybe a little bit of jokes here and there. Another potential setting or another potential suggestion would be to analyze the setting And maybe there are changes that we can make. For example, the lighting, or we could add music to aversive tasks. Sometimes the lighting is aversive. Sometimes there are smells that are aversive, especially if we're talking about transitioning to a different location. There might be something in that location that's aversive. As for the tasks itself, maybe if we played a little bit of light music during math, maybe that would make math less aversive. Maybe we could wear a sock puppet that praises kids only when they are engaging and complying with an aversive tasks. So the sock puppet only comes out during math and it walks around and it never comes out any other time. But during math, where all the kids trouble or struggle, the sock puppet comes out and it says to everybody, "Good job, you're doing a good job," or "Yes, that is 2 + 2 does equal 4." Maybe something like that. Or maybe we add movement to an aversive task. Movement is really important. So maybe we're having them do math, but after every problem, they have to stand up and do a jumping jack, something like that. And so that adds an element of fun. And it also adds an element of movement because sometimes staying seated in a structured activity, the staying seated part can be somewhat aversive. We could add three-dimensional elements or crafty elements. For example, if you're doing math and they're going to use counters, a lot of times we use the counters that look like little square blocks, right? Those are fine, but what if we had the kids make their own counters? What if they made counters the day before and we let them paint them and, color them and put, I don't know, sprinkles or feathers or sparkles or something on these counters? Then the next day, when we go to do the math activity, we give them the counters that they made. Well, okay, those counters are already paired with reinforcement. What that means is because they made them the day before and they had fun making them, when they see the counters, they kind of have a good feeling about it already. Like, yeah, all right, cool. So now we can take those counters that are stimulating this positive feeling and we can do math with a counter that is positive as opposed to a neutral counter, just one of those regular little square block things. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways we could try to make these transitions easier or make the task that we're transitioning to more exciting or more motivating. Okay, so that is the end of that. Do I have any questions from anybody?